So are you ready to plumb the depths of natural and theological order
Mm,
with our friend Peirce today? And I didn't sleep that well. It's never easy though. Never easy to make sense of these questions, but we'll do our best.
yeah, it's just not easy to do justice to them, Ryan.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, once more into the fray, into the dismal tide of theology. Uh,
Yeah. So the neglected argument
mm,
for the reality of God, which Peirce writes pretty late in his life. What, 1914, is that when he dies? And this was 1908.
yeah,
So it seems like he had been stewing on the connections between his logic and theology for many decades, and he's doing his best to lay out what he calls variously a humble hypothesis or neglected argument, whereby basically the triadic logic that he lays out would be I guess there are different ways to phrase it, but something like the exemplification of a proof of the existence of God that would be neither deductive nor inductive, or you know, but rather abductive, and which has to do with this instinct that we have to literally divine the order of things, because somehow our mind is continuous with that order. And for those who are, I think, like yourself, into Peirce's logic and the irreducibility of this triadic relationship, um, in our explorations of the natural world, it makes you uncomfortable that Peirce would want to say that this implies some kind of a god. And he uses that word, and he seems to be one of those geniuses, scientific and philosophical geniuses in the early 20th century, who or mid 20th century, who try to integrate evolution and Christianity, and find that there's actually um, a strangely neglected continuity between the Christian religion and its emphasis on history and evolutionary theory. Um, so Peirce, like Teilhard de Chardin, or like Whitehead himself, Steiner, Barfield, people like that, try to make these connections. But is this just a word problem? Are there other terms with less cultural baggage that would allow us to think of this logic as, yeah, somehow pointing to something sacred, even if we don't want to take a theist interpretation at it? Um, that's one question we could ask, but I don't know if you want to dive in straight on that question, because I know you've been you've been seeking ways to avoid this connection that Peirce is drawing between his logic and the Christian God, at least.
yeah. I mean, I don't know how I would characterize, I don't know that I'm seeking to avoid something. I don't know that I'm uncomfortable with it. One of the things I would like to say before we dive into it, I suppose, is just how much I appreciate this essay. um, I love this essay, actually. I think it's a really beautiful piece, and I do, of course, land somewhere a little bit different from Peirce, and I feel like it's perfectly justifiable and in the spirit of a kind of evolutionary love, the love of growing care to critique what's going on here. But it really is in the spirit of that kind of care and love, and sort of close and careful engagement. um, and Peirce talks about how this play of musement, which he believes will ultimately, it's basically meditation, which will ultimately culminate in the hypothesis of God's reality, not God's existence. We'll get into that in a second, I think, but of God's reality. Um, somewhat inevitably. You know, he says that it begins with our discovery in one of the three universes of some particular phenomenon, and then the careful attention and kind of loving engagement we give that phenomenon, and we view it from all of these different sides, and we don't try to leap to conclusions about it. We allow something to emerge sort of spontaneously. So it's a meditation on some particular phenomenon that we encounter. And I treat an essay like this very much in that sort of spirit, you know. This is a phenomenon that I encounter, and I try to engage with it as openly and fully as possible. And I find, I mean, I love it. You know, you get so much of Peirce the man from this as well. You know, there's so much personality. You know, he's very. You can really commune with him. You can get that sense of his mind from this. And really, that's what Peirce is talking about when he's talking about this humble argument, this neglected argument. The finding of God in experience is a kind of communing with the works of a great mind or of living mind. And there might be reasons to want to distinguish between those two things and see that there's an analogy between our engagement with, our communing with a great mind like Peirce's, that then leaves some mark on us, that informs our conduct, that informs the way we henceforth engage with the world. And that's you know, foreshadowing maybe a discussion of this also in terms of the pragmatic maxim, which is, you know, Peirce's ultimate arbiter of the truth, in a sense of the argument. But you know, I very much feel that I enter into that process when I read something like this. So I think that's just something I want to say. And also we'll discuss, I think, this supplementary article that we read by John Allen Schmidt. And I also want to say, before, you know, perhaps again disagreeing with certain things there, that I very much appreciate the scholarship, you know, Schmidt's scholarship. And I find that article to be extremely useful, even though I have my disagreements. So there's, you know, you might say that I'm uncomfortable in a certain sense with this argument, that this kind of contemplation leads inevitably to an acknowledgement or an acceptance or whatever of God's reality. But I find a profound comfort here. You know, I do actually, again, you know, really deeply appreciate this work and this kind of work. And I think, you know, if we're gonna jump into the kind of language aspect for a second, I've got so many notes as usual, and they're not super well organized, and they're not all from these articles either. But I want to pull out something that he says in a short article collected under the title of "The Concept of God," which I think is a relevant place to begin, because he does give us definitions in this article, "The Neglected Argument," but he says in "The Concept of God" as well, God is a vernacular word. God with a capital G in inverted commas is a vernacular word, and like all such words, but more than almost any, is vague. But that's not an issue for Peirce, right? Because he goes on to say, you know, let the logician do his best to substitute precise equivalents in their places, still the vernacular words alone, for all their vagueness, answer the principal purposes. This is emphatically the case with the very vague word God. So that's part of his argument for the use of the word, is that it's vernacular, yes, it's vague, it doesn't admit of a precise definition, and it shouldn't. And in fact, he thinks that, quote unquote, scientific people, logicians, etc., become atheists or imagine that they're atheists, because he also says that basically everybody believes in God. That's another claim that he makes. People delude themselves into thinking that they don't believe in God because they try to precisify the terms too much. It's like, no, this is not something that admits of this kind of precise definition. And when we'll probably get into, and we should get into, abduction, and its relation to deduction and induction. But one of the things that he says about abduction or retroduction, retro because arguing from consequent to antecedent, so it's the detection of a general fact about a collection of observables, the detection, but again not in a precise way, in an intuitive manner, and he refers to that, to abduction here and elsewhere, as a form of argument, but not a form of argumentation. And so the neglected argument itself, this argument for the existence of God, it's an argument, but it's not a form of argumentation. And I think we should get into Peirce on arguments in a little bit more detail, because that's also very interesting. So an argument is a sign that has the kind of predictable quality or consequence of inducing a particular belief in its interpretant, right? So an argument makes an interpretant. An argument is a sign that induces a belief in an interpretant. And there's a way, that this can be applied really interestingly, like in biology. We can say that an organism is an argument about its embedding environment or the embedding environments of its historical lineage. So does the organism lack eyes? Well, that might induce the belief in the interpretant that it lives underground or in a cave. Does it have fins? Well, or gills? It probably lives underwater then. Or this is the sense in which there's an argument. But and we maybe get into that in more detail. But just the key that I wanted to bring up here is the difference between an argument and argumentation, which is important for Peirce in this context, is that an argumentation proceeds from precisely defined premises, whereas an argument doesn't. So abduction is an argument, the neglected argument for the existence, for the reality rather, misspoke, for the reality of God, is an argument, but it doesn't admit of and doesn't proceed from precisely defined premises. So it's not an argumentation. It's actually the establishment and the work of abduction in concert with then deduction and induction as the stages of inquiry, first, second, and third in that order, is to provide the possibility of generating precise premises. Therefore, it cannot itself proceed from precise premises. And that's actually super important to our discussion of abduction way back in the relevance realization context, and why I think that they kind of got it wrong, but understandably. Because again, abduction is not proceeding from precise premises. It is the beginnings of the process of deriving precise premises.
Right. And, as often the case, there's a deep reading of Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, I think is the text, where he goes into these different forms of inquiry, and he doesn't use the Greek equivalent of abduction, but he talks about the way that, deduction needs to arrive at principles or premises, and, he uses the term arche to get at that. And, this abductive form of reasoning that Peirce brings out of the shadows is it's where all science begins, and all logic begins. And so without it, not only can you not have any knowledge of God, but you can't have any knowledge of nature either. And so he's trying to go back to the origin of things, and I love that he would think that everyone is secretly believing in God. Every atheist at least is secretly believing in God, because there's something so fundamental about the faith that we have in our own capacity to think and interpret and understand and know, that Peirce is basically identifying as thirdness ultimately, right? Which for him is somehow that's of the three universes, thirdness for Peirce becomes the the most divine, I guess, and the creator of the other, of firstness and secondness. And so we have to say that even if in the order of events and like the order of our experience of the empirical world, firstness, secondness, and thirdness go in that order, in a certain logical sense, thirdness is prior, or maybe ontological sense, thirdness is first.
This
Because
is certainly, sorry to interrupt, but this is certainly Schmidt's reading.
yeah,
I think Peirce himself, and I'm not the Peirce scholar that Schmidt is, but
he changes his opinion over
yeah, may admit of different readings. And I think that we can get into that as well. The series of quotes that Schmidt provides in support of this argument that you're articulating, which I think is a warranted, legitimate reading for sure. There are other quotes, even from the actual same series, like from the same articles or same lectures, where you can see him leaning in the other direction. I think there's a fundamental ambiguity there.
He's engaged in a process of self-interpretation and differing from himself and struggling with this question. But what's at stake, right, is pure chance enough to give rise to order and habit and mind? Or does there need to already be some habit-taking tendency implicit in the nature of things in order for chance and reaction and firstness and secondness, in other words, to then evolutionarily build up more and more forms of mind, I guess, in the history of the cosmos. And yeah, you can see in those excerpts in Schmidt's article that from Peirce how initially he thought pure chance was enough to do it, and then he says in conversation with others and in his own meditations, he's like, oh, maybe there does need to be some original habit-taking tendency, this divine thirdness that's there already. And so, yeah, there's two hypotheses here. And I'm also a little bit worried about thirdness coming first, as it were, because he's written a lot, and a lot of it's not even easily accessible as far as I can tell, in disarray. And but for him to identify God as a creator is problematic for me. That God is the creator of the two universes, firstness and secondness, from nothing. I'm not entirely comfortable with that, and his insistence on these three attributes of the traditional attributes of the divine, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. I'm cool with two of the three, but omnipotence, depending on what we mean by power, again, I think is problematic. There's a form of transcendence operative here that I'm worried about. But again, there's enough vagueness in his concept of God for another understanding, where he talks about this original thirdness as a symbol that is maximally vague or general or indeterminate, let's say, right? And so God originates in this indeterminacy that gradually becomes more determinate over the course of cosmic history. That starts to become more attractive to me, because then there's a conception of nothingness operative that's a kind of fecund or generative nothingness, and not just a mere passive matter awaiting the divine formation or divine direction. And so, yeah, there's a lot at stake here, because I'm also not sure that pure chance is enough. Because
I think, yeah, sorry.
yeah, I mean, where does you need memory, and can you, like, thirdness is weird, right? Because you could conceivably have a universe of just firstness and secondness, of just bare repetition of feeling that didn't go anywhere, that didn't do anything or become anything. And it seems like this added dimension of habit taking is mysterious if it's not there already. But on some level, maybe firstness and secondness already imply it, and we don't need to do this loop-de-loop move and put thirdness first.
Well, yeah, I think it is a problem actually to try and certainly in when we're speaking about actual existent things, we are, as opposed to the real, which is a broader concept, then it's clearly in Peirce's own system fallacious to imagine that you can have an existent thing that doesn't in some way partake of all three of the categories. So I think it may be this is why I would, to cut to the chase, and we'll next thing we're going to read in a fortnight, I think, is for a discussion in a fortnight, is The Problem of the Fourth by Jung. I would say grounding everything in a generative fourthness, which is the kind of dark precursor of all three. Some one thing which actually does to some degree all of the things, fulfills all of the functions that the firstness, secondness, and thirdness is going to be a more felicitous way, for a bunch of different reasons, for me, to try and resolve this kind of issue. I mean, it may kind of seem like a fudge, but there are fudges throughout, in a way. It's a total fudge to say that thirdness comes first, that there's this, disembodied mind and capacity of habit. Like, Peirce is also kind of clear on this, and I think that the potential challenge with the Schmidt reading, and one need to go through with a very, very fine-toothed comb and weigh the different, if it were a matter of Peirce scholarship, which for me is ultimately secondary, like I find Peirce very generative, but I don't particularly care I care in this sort of sense of loving engagement with a great mind, but I don't need to find myself where Peirce finds himself, right? So I'm looking for,
if he even did find himself. I mean, he may have continued to think about this and be uncertain until the end of his life.
And I think that the biographical evidence is that he became more and more, not that he wasn't always somewhat religious, but that he became more and more personally religious, and he became more and more invested in this sort of pragmatic maxim, which is that this experience of the reality of God must be measured through its capacity to inform one's conduct. And he says a lot of these things in the Neglected Argument article. And I think there's a way in which he's reforming his own, we talked about this in our last session on Peirce, somewhat dissolute, existence. He's also doing a lot of morphine, whether that influences our thoughts or not. Perhaps it shouldn't, but so he was certainly disposed to states of rapture, and that's a beautiful thing, whether they are elicited by or involve the elicitation by exogenous chemistry or not. If only one's own biochemistry is involved, so to speak, makes little difference. But he was prone to this rapturous experience and writing about it beautifully. And again, that's what we find in this article, The Neglected Argument, and that's wonderful. But whether we then take that as some sort of summative statement, I think that one of the issues I have with the structure of Peirce's thought altogether is he does have a tendency towards a belief in the summative, actually, in the final. He believes that there has to be, we talked about this last time, like the evolutionary realism to him, there are these 2 points in the infinite past and the infinite future. And in the infinite future, it's the dead fossilized world, basically, where growth has been completed, the action of mind essentially has been fully discharged. And you have this scatter crystal, as we say, the crystal at the end of time, which would be this pure world of pure secondness. And again, he says this is not an existent thing, but it's a real thing. And okay, if you look through, in many places in his thought, including in this argument, this article, you will find that that structure, that diagram of the complete discharge of some excitation to be operative for Peirce kind of all the time. Like, he talks about the way in which, you could basically explain everything that he's talking about in the neglected argument through the action of chance and some skerrick of a higher principle. So a bit of thirdness, but it's largely, firstness. It's largely this chancy thing. But that would leave a certain, I mean, what does he say? I have to, again, too many notes. I have to look it up. But it would leave a certain mental excitation. That's not exactly his term. It's right. An agitation. It would leave the remnant of a needful mental explanation. So he wouldn't be satisfied with that. He would still feel like he hadn't discharged his nervous energy, basically, because it wasn't a complete explanation. So it does feel, when he says little things like that, that he just has that need to reach some kind of terminus. And that the only kind of terminus for that sort of process, and I do think this is in real conflict or in tension with his fallibilism overall, but the only way to terminate that is in some sort of conception of the ultimate, whether that's the ultimate end of pure crystallization or it's the ultimate ground in some sense. And this for me is a problem, like he's looking for this thorough satisfaction, this thoroughly satisfying explanation of the threefold environment. But really, if especially in the sense that you're talking about it, in the sense that Schmidt tries to bring out, if we ground it in the pure thirdness of a creator God, that's an explanation by fiat. That's a kind of a forced move. I will discharge this mental excitation, this constant search for explanatory knowledge, by saying, well, this is the ultimate terminus of that process. And to me, that's just, I get it. I fully get it. I understand the desire to terminate that agitation, that needful mental explanation. But it's like a termination of the play of Musement. It's in tension with what he's saying about the meditation, the meditative process itself. It becomes there's a way that I think, and we're going to go through Jung and other things, but there's a psychoanalytic perspective on, and I don't want to psychoanalyze Peirce too much. I want to take his arguments, as he presents them. But I think that there's tension, because he does provide us this, and I think it's not also to be just brushed aside that he refers to tychism and chance as firstness, that he doesn't refer to thirdness as firstness, right? There's a reason why he originally came up with that way, and he came up with it that way. And he gives us actually one of the most developed images and most scientific, with the science and logic of his time, most integrated images of a cosmology, a cosmogenesis with a groundless ground, a self-organizing ground. He really gives us that in a beautiful way, but he is not himself fully comfortable with that. And I think that's what we see play out in some of these little comments. And again, his constant need to return to these ultimate endpoints or ultimate grounds. That's a tension in him. And maybe if we do look at the facts of his life and the fact that he there was maybe too much of the tychic or the anarchic in his behavior, and he was looking to increasingly perhaps compensate for that later in his life. And again, there's a tension here, and we find this in a lot of these great thinkers who are attempting to achieve balance between, just say broadly speaking, the aesthetic and the mathematical logical aspects of their thought. There can be this tension, and I don't think Peirce, and I think it's actually to his credit that he doesn't really finally resolve this. But I think there are a lot of places in which he's seeking that kind of final resolution, and I think that the Schmidt reading avoids like it kind of jumps on it a little bit too hard. The final resolution of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the Jungian reading of the maybe um, psychological compensation going on there, because I much prefer the Peirce who, wants to say things like the creation of the universe did not take place on a certain busy week in the year 4004 BC, but is going on today and never will be done. And that's 1903. He's writing this. I'm not sure the title of that essay, but collected papers 1.615 that is cited in Schmidt's article. So he cosmologically at least is affirming the ongoingness of creation,
Yeah.
and not needing there to be some final crystal at the end of time. Because, and his sense of truth as and his discomfort with, to put it mildly, the Jamesian form of pragmatism where truth becomes mutable. He wants truth to be something that we might not have now,
Yeah.
but that the ideal community in the infinite future may arrive at.
But by in his own terms, that's death. That's the dead universe.
Yeah.
So truth is mutable until everything is dead.
Mm-hmm.
That's a Peircean way of putting it, but he's in tension with that reading. I mean, I think he's right that James and the pragmatists, that Peirce felt he needed to distinguish his renaming of his doctrine as pragmaticism from, are unbalanced in the other direction.
Yeah.
But and he's the one really sitting with the tension in a certain sense, but yeah, by his own reading, that truth with a capital T, that immutable truth, is death.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah.
Right. But the James's Peirce's pragmaticism, as he renames it, is still emphasizing the practical consequences. And so it's like most arguments for the existence of God rather than the reality of God are theoretical. It's like, can we arrive at some logical or empirical, form of argumentation that would give us a sense of cognitive satisfaction? And while abductive proofs of God's reality may give us some satisfaction, I think what Peirce is really pointing to is the consequence of belief in it as the truth, as the test of the truth of the argument. The consequences are the test, not some purely theoretical proof that would just be would cause us to cognitively assent to it, but whether it allows us to grow as people, and bring us closer to his sense of the universe itself as a kind of as it he describes the universe itself as an argument, or a work of art or a great poem. And so truth for him becomes, to some degree, the way I would understand it is the degree to which we can participate in the furthering of the articulation of that cosmic argument or that poem, conducting ourselves in alignment with that activity, allows us to become true, or to become towards truth, without having to say that we possess the final truth now.
Yeah. But again, that's intention in his thought, because you're giving this beautiful sort of processual, participatory reading of truth, which is very developed in Peirce's thought, but he's in tension with that too. Let's do exist and real, because we've brought these up a number of times, and I think we're going to keep coming back to what you've just been beautifully articulating. I mean, the sense in which the cosmos, the universe, is an argument, in a macrocosmic argument, in the way that an organism is a microcosmic argument about its embedding environment. The cosmos as a whole, in terms of this neglected argument, is an argument for the existence of God. So the
Yeah.
fact that it is ordered, that we find this aesthetic joy and appreciation in the forms that we find and contemplate in these different corners of the triune real, of any part of the three universes, that is an argument that there's something, kind of behind it that is ordering it. But yeah, so this thing behind it, if we're calling it God, and Peirce is calling it God, obviously, is real but not existent. So Peirce defines real at the beginning of this particular essay, and then I'll jump to another one for existence, because don't think he really says that here. Real is a word invented in the 13th century, so it's a scholastic thing. It's the Scotus versus Occam, etc. Realism versus nominalism debate is the context, to signify having properties and possessing these properties, whether they be anywise attributed to it by any single man or group of men or not. Okay, so these properties exist independent of us, basically, right? But I think the important gloss that we would want to put on it, and I think, again, Peirce admits of this reading in other places, but certainly Whitehead elaborates this, and certainly the way we want to take some of these thinkers into dialogue with something like the free energy principle can give us a way to articulate this. But we want to talk about a relational real and a constructed relational real. So it's not as if things have properties out in some vacuum of pure isolation, because I've argued with you before, not with you, but to you, that properties are intrinsically relational, right? Because property means detectable or observable in some sense, right? So this is a good definition of real, but nothing is real without attribution, because properties are relational. So it doesn't have to be attributed by a human, or even any organism or being that we would normally consider sentient or an observer in some sort of colloquial sense. But if we're going fully relational, and we can just tap Smolin's notion of a causal theory of views here or something, and this is obviously a Leibnizian idea, which is deeply in Peirce's DNA. Basically, it's not men, as Peirce says, it's not humans or whatever who are the attributors or arbiters here. Becoming is a process of self-attribution for the kind of process relational cosmology that I think we want to extract from these sorts of things. So the self-attributing real, or the self-evidencing real, to take the free energy principle terminology. And I think this is I'm not going to resolve this issue right here in this little spiel, especially with such a tired brain, and maybe I haven't even resolved it for myself, but this is a key issue when people move away from what they take to be realism, which they take to mean that there's this independent structure out there that is what it is, independent of any kind of observation. And they say, well, they either say that's not true, or they say, well, we can never have any access to that because our only access is mediated, is observation. Therefore, either there is no real, or it's inaccessible, so we can't talk about it. And so they go into various flavors of, anti-realism or different forms of skepticism or whatever. And it's like, no, all of that is predicated on it's either the notion that there are two worlds. So there's the world of appearance and the world of reality. Okay. That's one of the notions there. When people say, well, we can't access that true structure, so we can't talk about it. Or there's simply this idea that there is therefore no for real. It's there is therefore no real, and that's what Popper would call this kind of failed verificationism. Like, because we don't have direct unmediated access, because we can't know the thing in itself, we're very disappointed by that. So we just go, oh, well, there's no such thing as we just kind of, as a knee-jerk response to that, we're like, okay, then blow that up, that doesn't exist at all. And there are there are middle grounds here, right? And
Mhm.
that's this constructive realism that we're talking about. But I'll just really quickly, well, you jump in because we'll talk about existence in a second, what distinguishes the real from existence. Yeah.
Well, just that we can avoid these extremes. I forget who came up with these terms. Was it Sellers, maybe? The myth of the given and the myth of the framework. You know, we can find a middle path here, and not have to go with this absurdity of models all the way down, because it's self-undermining, and nor are we arguing for kind of naive realism. Obviously, the pragmatic or pragmaticist approach here, I think is sufficiently realistic, Peirce's version at least, in the full sense of realism about generals, whereas James doesn't give us that that sense of generals being true. They're emergent in Peirce's universe, but they're still real. And
Are they
they
emergent? So Schmidt would say they're not. Schmidt would say, in some sense, that
that the Platonic, well, yeah, and he's quoting Peirce saying this Platonic world of ideas is really what he means by firstness.
Yeah, but what else does Peirce say about the Platonic? Hold on. Where is it? The evolutionary process is therefore not a mere evolution of the existing universe, but rather a process by which the very Platonic forms themselves have become or are becoming developed.
Yeah.
That's Peirce.
Yeah. That's beautiful. So it's an evolutionary realism. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this helps with Whitehead's eternal objects being removed from time and history, and I like to read Whitehead and Peirce together on that question. But yeah, and also, I want you to go on to differentiate existence from reality as relevant to what Peirce's argument for the reality of God is here. But I also am just curious to mark a distinction that might be similar, or at least somehow resonant, Heidegger's beings distinction, or a distinction between thatness and whatness. That there's, when we talk about God as a being, we're not talking about a being among beings. We're talking about necessary being, and that is not something that could be said to exist if existence means to exist alongside other existent things, in a kind of secondness, right? But I want to hear what you were going to quote from some other article on that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, you basically said it in so many words, just right there, because Peirce says in the concept of God, I always use exist in its strict philosophical sense of react with the other like things in the environment. Yeah. And then he goes on and say, so yeah, exactly as you say, that's the relationship of secondness. So those kinds of reactions are kind of brute, reflexive, almost not in terms of reflection, but in terms of like they're reactive. And then he says, of course, in that sense, it would be fetishism to say that God exists, that God isn't in this relationship of secondness. And, I think maybe a place which is worth examining as well, and, there's this in Whitehead too, is the distinction maybe between like pantheism and panentheism. And there are problems, famous problems with certain readings of pantheism. And if you have the attribution of like those three attributions that you mentioned before of omnipotence and omniscience in particular, and then you have a pantheism, so you make God and world, then you seem to end up with a deterministic situation. But of course, if you don't have those attributions, you maybe don't have that issue. And I think
people do you still have God is the question a theist would have.
Well, that is the question. Of course, hence Spinoza being, exiled or banished or kicked out of the Jewish faith and all of that, right? But I do also think there's a way in which the tension in Peirce is that when he gives us the universe of firstness first, the self-constructing universe, that could be, we could still have a conception of God there, but that would become pretty much necessarily a pantheism as opposed to a panentheism, where I think Peirce wants to go in that direction where, you know, the universe is within God, and or he has this tension in his thought. Because to say that God is real but doesn't exist could, and of course we can go Deleuzian with this, with the virtual and the real. There are lots of different ways of handling this distinction between, you know, the real and the actual, the real and existence. And then there are, you know, there are really thoroughgoing thinkers of immanence who want to critique even Deleuze here. You know, like Deleuze is not immanentist enough in some way. But yeah, I think when you yeah, again, this may be a tension that is partly articulated in the way that Peirce is using the distinction between the real and the existent. And what we get is this notion that, again, Schmidt wants to draw out, where, because Peirce does say this, you know, God is independent of two of the three universes. So God is independent, as Schmidt draws it out, of firstness and secondness, because God is the thirdness that creates them. But I think that reading can't be sustained across Peirce's cosmology in other ways, because he's also pretty clear about habit. You know, habit can't come first. Like, there could be a tendency, there could be a propensity for habit taking first, but you can't have habits first. You can't have habits without the generative action of firstness, and even secondness, reaction amongst things. And then some reactions are more frequent or more stable than others, and this is the formation of habits. And again, you know, Peirce may not be fully consistent about that, but that's something that he says about habit. Whereas I think if we change the image a little bit and we say that God, per se, could be independent of two of the three universes, but it's actually a God of firstness, which, like, God cannot be independent of firstness. God is within this pure potentiality of you know, of, like, basically creativity in Whitehead's sense, or really the virtual in Deleuze's sense. Then again, we perhaps get a vision that's maybe more pantheistic. I don't know if you want to, if I'd like to hear you comment on that, but it's more consistent with the rest of Peirce's cosmology when he's not waxing quite as explicitly theological. It's always theology, right? I'm not saying that it's not, but
yeah, I mean, one of the most intriguing bits that I think overlaps between Peirce's neglected argument essay and then Schmidt's interpretive analysis of it is, in Peirce's article, he talks about growth and purpose in the universe and the way that thirdness is purposeful, and that, yeah, there's this learning process that unfolds, and that because of this, he can't fully deny that God grows, which means that something that's supposed to be eternal and immutable changes. And so he's doesn't really resolve that tension. He just says we have to talk about God as if God is purposeful, God is growing with the universe, with this historic process, but also God is obviously not growing. God is something transcendent. And so there are these moments where he wants to clearly differentiate his vision here from any kind of pantheism. You know, but at the same time, God is immanent in this process as the thirdness, which allows for all these habits to emerge. And then in Schmidt's piece, he talks, it's so, he quotes Peirce talking about the nothing, the indeterminate of the absolute beginning as a symbol, but a symbol which is maximally vague, which is meaningless precisely because it means everything. It means nothing in particular. There's nothing to be distinguished in it. And it got me thinking about, you know, Whitehead's version of the primordial nature of God, envisaging infinite possibility and achieving a kind of infinite value. But that infinite value is, in a sense, it's worthless. Like, value only becomes of any significance in its in its finitude, because it's this and not that. There's something about the achievement of a finite value that is somehow morally and aesthetically greater than infinite value. And it seems like that's
incarnation.
Yeah, incarnation, which Peirce wants to affirm, that somehow divine creativity seeks embodiment. He describes it he speaks in terms of reason when he talks about that. I don't know if I can find the quote right now, but just this idea that the vagueness of God as having, he talks about God contracting God's self. So this nothingness out of which God creates is in a sense God's own kenosis, God's own self-emptying, making it nothing of God's self in order for there to be room to create something other than God, which I find, quite compelling, quite reminiscent of Kabbalah. It's not a fully original idea, but Peirce is only saying that we are naturally led in our own musement and imaginative contemplation towards these sorts of hypotheses. So it makes sense that, and you find it in the Hermetic literature and Kabbalah and various mystical traditions, these doctrines of divine creation from nothing, but a kind of nothing that's not just out there waiting for God to do something with it, but that God had to, it's the result of some kind of self-sacrifice that God makes, such that there should be some nothing in order to create within. And then Peirce also talks about evil, which he seems to relate to secondness, and calls it, though, he says, evil, we have to bless God for the law of growth with all the fighting it imposes upon us. Evil, that is what it is in man's duty to fight, being one of the major perfections of the universe. And so God is not secondness, as you were saying, and yet God creates secondness, and that secondness is one of the major perfections of the universe. Evil is one of the major perfections of the universe. I mean, these are the sorts of thoughts that evolutionary theology is ultimately led to when it comes to making sense of strife and how it can somehow contribute to the realization of greater love. This is I think one of the most difficult aspects of evolutionary theology, really, is, but also it holds the most promise, because the problem of evil is both one of the I think it's the most significant reason I think a lot of people leave religion, because they don't find any satisfying account of it in any theologian or in their church pastor trying to make sense of terrible things that happen. And so they just think, well, there can't possibly be a God. I haven't heard a satisfying account of why there should be this intensity of evil in the world. But regardless of whether or not it's causing people to leave, traditional religions, even if we're not religious, we still have the problem of theodicy, because we want to lead meaningful lives. We want to think that we have some sway over the course of future events, and that we can play a ameliorative role in this process, which I think again flows from Peirce's sense that whether or not we say enunciate the proposition, I believe in God, that there's still some underlying theological, we're assenting to a theological reality just by virtue of trying to interpret our experience and the world, and conduct ourselves so as to contribute to its further positive evolution and unfolding. That
largely because theology has been the domain in which those problematics have been articulated, and thus when we try to articulate them ourselves, we are necessarily entering into a discourse with a great history that is essentially a theological history. So there's a convention here, but in this deep sense of conventionalism that we've talked about before. This is this is a traditional context in which the context of theodicy, in which to work through precisely those problems. So in a sense, we're always in the theological context, always engaging with the problem of theodicy when we're thinking about freedom and agency and all of those sorts of things, because that happens to be the historical context in which those discussions have been had.
And all of the heterodox pan-theological voices in that tradition, which have been marginalized, like Spinoza, like Bruno, I mean, others for whom the God-world relationship, which, you know, pan as an all or the universe, we're trying to think God's relationship to the world in a way that would resolve this shock that we feel in the face of the evil of existence, so as to allow ourselves to continue to exist, you know. And so, you know, Camus' existentialist point is one way of enunciating this in the 20th century. You know, whether or not to commit suicide is the only serious philosophical question. Because if we don't find a solution to that, and it doesn't need to be a deductive argument, it doesn't need to be some kind of empirical proof, it's an abductive argument. We feel our way to a solution to that problem if we get out of bed every morning. You know, we've unconsciously decided that that problem can be resolved, right? And I think there's this whole issue of an optimistic versus a pessimistic attitude that Peirce gets into a little bit, which again is reminiscent of James's varieties of religious experience, the where he talks about the healthy-minded and the sick-souled. I think of Fichte also, who talks about that the type of philosophy one identifies with depends on the kind of person one is. So if one's a dogmatist or a transcendental idealist or whatever else, it's a characterological thing.
Yeah.
And so
certainly Nietzsche and then Jung will run with that thought as well. There's a psychological critique of all metaphysics, of all theology, of all philosophy. And this is this loopiness with the three categories as well, right? Because the psychological critique of metaphysics is the firstness of direct experience, of feeling, you know, drawing a critique from that domain to critique the thirdness, which is speculative. In my terms is speculative reality. I guess in Peirce's terms is objective idealism. Peirce's,
and you know, psychologizing theology and philosophy is super important. And I think there's one way to understand theology as a kind of, it's a process of self-parenting, by which I mean becoming an adult for whom, you know, one's biological parents are no longer the source of authority, nor the source of one's own identity through reaction against their authority. But we sort of come to internalize that whole,
well, it's funny
power dynamic.
talking about that and talking about this Oedipal dynamic, perhaps, and how, I mean, that is allegmatically precisely theology already, you know, already, you know, the problem of psychoanalysis is the problem of theology. You know, these are, and I mean, lots of psychoanalysts, Jung obviously, but not only, even Lacan and you know, have recognized this. And that's the sense in which the psychoanalyst is the, you know, modern secular priest. There's so much in what you're saying, and I mean the problem of evil, and you know, in Evolutionary Love, Peirce will kind of draw on a doctrine of the privatio boni, which you know, evil is not a positive principle as such, but is the privation of good. But we know from our readings of Jung, and we've discussed that in Answer to Job, that he's very critical of that. And actually, Peirce and Jung are very close, I think, on these issues. But you know, Peirce is gesturing towards a doctrine which Jung has gone very hard against, but they give us a kind of similar. I mean, even to the point of Peirce saying, right, even in this essay, I think, neglected argument, but also elsewhere, that God is, strictly speaking, unconscious. And I think, you know, psychoanalysis structurally just goes that tiny step further. God is the unconscious, you know, and so another way of thinking about existence is in comparison to, in contradistinction with insistence. So God doesn't exist, but God insists. That's how we think about the unconscious. The unconscious doesn't exist. It's not a thing amongst things that is reacting with other things, but it is something we know by its perturbation, through its perturbations of consciousness. So we infer. So it's like in this Peircean sense now, the perturbations of consciousness, the eruption of alien contents that we don't, that the ego doesn't identify with, the constant agitation generated by the encounter with the internal and external otherness, the uncanniness, the unheimlich of the world. These perturbations of our conscious experience are arguments for the existence of the unconscious. So that is the insistence of the unconscious. We know it through its effect, which now it just sounds like a theological argument. We know it. We shall know him, but through his works or whatever, right? We can't know God directly, but God insists in this argumentative sense. Well, it's not an argumentation, but it's an argument through our contemplation of his works. There's so many places I want to go with this, because the evil thing is going back to the fourth, the suppressed or repressed fourth, which is the generative ground, the germinal nothing, which is a term that Peirce will use. But it's the body, right? Okay, the fourth is the body, and this is feminine because the female aspect can do it all. Doesn't, and think biologically speaking, think parthenogenesis, think asexual reproduction. The female aspect is much closer to being able to do everything. I mean, in a sexual species, not quite, but it's incredible, just as a momentary biological digression, how many species we have thought were obligate sexual reproducers, which in captivity, and captive bred animals even, which have never had exposure to a female, where we can rule out sperm retention, which is another thing. It turns out a lot of species that we didn't know can actually retain living sperm cells. The females can retain them for extended periods of time, but also can reproduce. We used to think asexual reproduction was mostly like single-cell organisms, and then a few multicellular organisms and things. But no, it's like lots of lizards can do it. Lots of animals can do this. Komodo dragons can do it, which is like crazy in a sense. This giant lizard. Anyway, that's.
I didn't know there was so much evidence for virgin birth in the animal kingdom. I really.
Yeah. I mean, it just increases all the time, because because of it's rare with a lot of these species, but it's only, we've had this Komodo dragon in captivity for 15 years or whatever, and maybe it's captive bred, and then suddenly it's laying fertile eggs, and it's like, hang on, how's this happening? Well, we do a genetic analysis. This is parthenogenesis. But so there's this whole kind of sordid history with the suppression of the fourth, the suppression of the feminine. And we talked about this a little bit, but if the fourth, as the dark precursor, the body itself, can do in a shadowy way all the things that 1, 2, and 3 can do, that 1, 2, and 3 are all derivative in a certain sense, well, we're going to get into this when we talk about Jung and the problem of the fourth. So we can bracket that for now, I think. But that's part of where the discussion of evil makes me want to go. But I want to talk about growth as well. I mean, I want to read a little bit from that section that you referred to, and then I'll go to the prior section. He's argued in the prior section, which I'll get to, that the hypothesis, the whole hypothesis, being itself inevitably subject to the law of growth, appears in its vagueness to represent God as so, albeit this is directly contradicted in the hypothesis in the very first phase, God being eternal and all of that. But this apparent attribution of growth to God, since it is ineradicable from the hypothesis, and that's because the growth itself, as I'll just get to in a second, maybe I should have gone the other way around, but is one of the existence of growth is one of the key arguments for the existence of God that he presents in this essay. But it's ineradicable from the hypothesis, and therefore it cannot, according to the hypothesis, be flatly false. Like the attribution of growth to God can't be flatly false. And he gets really kind of ambiguous here, because he's saying, it will be partly disavowed and yet to be held less false than its denial would be. And the hypothesis will lead to our thinking of features of each universe as purposed, and this will stand or fall with the hypothesis. Yet a purpose essentially involves growth, and so cannot be attributed to God. He's already said God is unconscious as well. So God has no purpose, and that would lean us, and this is where I'm going here, foreshadowing to a more Taoist kind of image of God. Still, it would, according to the hypothesis, be less false to speak so than to represent God as purposeless. So you can't really say God has purpose, but it's less false to speak that way than to represent God as purposeless. So he's like totally in tension with himself, and he's like, I said it, in the previous discussion, Peirce wants to have all the cake, so to speak, like he wants to have everything here. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. But yeah, earlier on, and I've abstracted this quote so I can get, so what is, he talks about what is universal across the three universes. So the triune real, the universe of tychism, firstness, chance, the universe of logical realism, which is reactive secondness, and the universe of objective idealism, which is thirdness. And I kind of redescribe these myself as prosaic reality, inquired reality, and speculative reality, 1, 2, 3. And again, we should get, by the way, to abduction, deduction, and induction, but that's not where I'm going right now. But we need to do that to do justice to the logical content of the arguments here as well. But he says what's universal across the three universes is the occurrence of growth. So again, it's like I said, with the Platonic forms themselves evolving. So even in the and it's unclear sometimes, are the Platonic forms thirds? Are they in the objective idealists, or are they in fact firsts? This is also unclear. But anyway, regardless of that, they are themselves growing and evolving, as obviously the actual existent world is. And there is the provision for later stages in earlier ones. So basically, he's, again, defending evolutionary realism here. What's universal across all of the universes is growth and the provision for later stages in earlier ones. Yeah, we all just call that evolution, right? And then he says, this is a specimen of certain lines of reflection which will inevitably suggest the hypothesis of God's reality. So when we're reflecting on growth, that line of reflection will inevitably, he has the temerity to say, suggest the hypothesis of God's reality. I mean, and, maybe as a matter of historical record, it often has. We imagine that growth requires nurturing, husbandry, love, but I'm gonna just offer a different view on that, coming from the Japanese poet, so really the Zen tradition, but I think it's very, very close then to the Taoist tradition. And Zen is descended from Chan, which is Chinese Buddhism, which is deeply Taoist as well. Hopefully I'm not, offending anybody by saying that. And not that I'm a comparative religious scholar, clearly, but Peirce maybe could have benefited in a lot of these reflections from a little bit more comparative study. But Basho says, sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself, right? So growth is happening. The grass is growing by itself. Right? We're doing nothing. We're observing. And we always have this option. And that is the and to me, and perhaps my reading won't have elicited that in listeners, but to me, that little poetic phrase is so beautiful. And it stimulates in me all of these things that the neglected argument, the humble argument is, and the play of Musement, the Spieltrieb, the play drive, which Peirce is getting from Schiller, that's the play of Musement as a form of meditation. It can suggest God's reality, and I think we mustn't be allergic to that suggestion, and we should read essays like this even if we are not ourselves believers and all of that. And I think there are so many reasons why, and so much of our conversation has turned into this an argument for the necessity of engaging with theology, but it can also lead to this just ongoing engagement with and continual return to firstness, you know, treating the thing in its firstness. It's just growing, you know, it's just doing that itself. And so strictly speaking of the three universes then, and why I think God is in the prosaic, is that, you know, we do have these experiences, and they may, you know, have this suggestion of God, and that can, you know, be like interpreted as a direct experience of God. But whenever we're interpreting, remember, we're always leaving the firstness, and we are even as faintly as possible, even using the most vague possible vernacular word, as Peirce defines God, but remembering that that is the vaguest, you know, possible vernacular word within a particular discourse, within a particular cultural traditional context. In other cultural contexts, that's not necessarily the word that people would reach for. But whenever we reach for a word, we're entering into the, to go psychoanalytic, symbolic order. And the symbolic order feels to us as though, because we enter into it and it's pre-established, right? When we don't create our language, we enter into this space, we are interpolated into it as infants, and it initially assaults us. It's kind of traumatic because it's this vast space of reason which massively exceeds us. So in Jungian terms, it's numinous, right? It is autonomous to us, and it's all this order which is autonomous to us. And a natural response to that, perhaps, is to posit what Lacan would call a master signifier, which is to posit a guarantor of the order, of that symbolic order. But I would say, as a matter of evolutionary thinking, that's a transcendental illusion. That's to come to a fully formed structure and to then posit, in attempting to account for the existence of that structure, something that was generated in the process, in fact, of, you know, the evolution, the development of that structure itself. Because language doesn't begin with a master signifier. Language grows organically out of sound and gesture and out of the iconic and indexical, right, before it becomes symbolic. Anyway, what am I trying to say? There is this possibility, as the, you know, to stay within the play of Musement without reaching in, and not, you know, we can't live our lives there, but not terminating that. And again, this is Peirce's recourse to an ultimate, to a master signifier. There's a certain kind of, you know, energy, excitement, agitation almost, that comes from us being immersed in the midst of life.
Yeah.
And when we reach outwards for the guarantor of that order that we're perceiving and all of that, we are, in a sense, making a cut. We're making a break. And again, could be we can take this in very Lacanian directions, because the real, in Lacanian sense, is unbearable, right? So we're always retreating from the real into the symbolic or into the imaginary. And that's, Lacan's triad, right? Which could be, you know, which can kind of be mapped on a little bit, but let's not do that violence right now, onto Peirce's. But yeah, I think that there are just, you know, you bringing up growth just stimulated this in me, or stimulated me to refer to this section of my notes, something I prepared earlier. But yeah, Peirce is really strong on the inevitability of this. And I say, I don't think that that's inevitable. I think that there are other ways of responding to those experiences. And it's not through a lack of relatability to the way he responds to them. It's not a lack of that kind of experience. It's not because of a lack of that kind of experience that I say that. It's a certain kind of fidelity to that experience that I'm trying to maintain.
I mean, from my point of view, any theism that's worth considering is going to be Taoist. And the other side of that coin is that even the Taoists came up with this name for the ultimate. there's something Taoist about negative theology. It's a sort of unsaying of God and the crossed out God, and I think that's an important auto critique that's already there, going back to the church fathers and Gregory of Nyssa and Pseudo Dionysius and all these thinkers for whom it was very clear that we need to develop and can only understand the divine in a paradoxical way in terms
which
of
is,
coincidence of opposites. And
which is the tradition that Jung thinks of himself as faithful to.
exactly, yeah. And so growth happens, and there's a stanza in Whitman's or a section in Whitman's Song of Myself that begins, "The child said, 'What is the grass?'" which I immediately thought of when you mentioned Basho's statement there, which I won't read, but I'll link it to people for people to read in the show notes. But he basically asks, "What is the grass?" And ends by making it clear that he's looking at grass at a cemetery, and that this vegetative capacity and I think he's in the background thinking of the Sermon on the Mount and the lilies that don't toil and don't spin and don't ask about tomorrow, and like living in the eternal present. And I thought of some extra reading I was doing earlier, of an interpreter of Peirce who made a very big deal of Peirce's doctrine of interpretation, Josiah Royce, who in the early 1900s he wrote this book, The Problem of Christianity, 2 volumes, I believe, which was published while Peirce was still alive. But he's drawing on Peirce's logic and using it to understand the very nature of time and the very nature of the triad as a way of understanding how our present experience is always an interpretation of the past to our own future, and that for Royce, the implications of this triad in temporal synthesis, let's call it, though he would challenge the term synthesis, that's more of a Kantian idea there, but this interpretive process that we're engaged in moment by moment, for Royce, takes on profound significance in our attempt to be loyal to communities of other interpretants, and that it ends up allowing him to argue that in a pragmatic sense, but Peirce allows Royce to argue for what he calls absolute pragmatism, because there's a kind of, Peirce and Royce are both idealists, different species of idealists, subjective idealists, I guess you could say, or absolute idealists even. And so for Royce, this theology that Peirce is allowing us to articulate through his triad consists in our capacity to be loyal to the community of interpretation, whereby we assent to the possibility that that truth is real, and that we can come to know it, but only ever together, right? So truth becomes social, and in some sense even a social construct, but it's a social construct in just the same way that the very passage of time, whether in a human being's experience of themselves and the interpretation of their own past to a future self, or in the way that a molecule is able to maintain its definite characteristics from moment to moment, through a process of semiosis, whereby it's somehow interpreting its past to its future and thereby achieving or maintaining a habit and growing even in the context of a whole ecology of other molecules, perhaps. And so, I think Royce is making these connections to what we even mean by the concept of society. And I think I thought of it because you mentioned Lacan and the symbolic order, and which would be for Lacan the domain of the father, basically, right? And I think of what I was getting into earlier about theology as self-parenting. This is one of the main challenges with our being welcomed or pushed into the symbolic order as we learn to speak and as we become, equal parts terrified and intrigued by the possibilities that language affords us. That we have to avoid this attempt to clutch after or clutch for a transcendental signifier, a signified that would provide an anchor, for all meaning, instead of recognizing that the truth, that to the extent that there is something transcendent that we want to be able to signify, we're always constructing that together, and that society becomes this shared project that's always tentative and always failing. And I think what Royce is suggesting is that there's a certain ethos embedded in this logic, that we remain faithful or loyal to this community project of meaning making, even when in any given instance of our attempt to communicate, we fail. We are not understood and don't understand each other. That nonetheless, we have a reason, because of cynicism, because of this divine source, that we may succeed next time or in some indefinite future. And so I think it's with Lacan, you don't get any sense of, I feel like Lacan leaves us sort of like, the best we could hope for in terms of mental health is to become adjusted to our trauma, to the trauma of being severed from mother and flung into the symbolic order, and that there's nothing of any sort of consolation in reality for us.
I think you described theology as self-parenting, and I think that's very consistent with the idea that you enter into analysis under the assumption that the analyst is the subject who knows, the subject's supposed to know. You enter in, you're in this neurotic state because you believe that there is a big other, and you want the answers that would be that kind of consolation, right? But then you learn to become your own parent, basically, and you learn that by, yes, accepting this kind of fundamentally, I think this would take us too far afield, and it's a reading that certainly a lot of Lacanians would want to resist, but partly
it just sounds pessimistic, to use Peirce's terms, more pessimistic than the optimistic vision he's giving of. It's in a more optimistic triad than the Lacanian triad, which seems
and I think probably temperamentally Lacan was a much more cynical individual, although they both were unfaithful and lots of various whatever we might moralize about both of their lives. But I think that there's a way in which the goal of psychoanalysis is to enable us to become comfortable with or accepting of our vitality, basically, which is our constant differing. So we will never be fully seen, we will never be recognized within the symbolic order, because we are not reducible, because yes, we are fundamentally alienated from that order, but that's because that alienation is our vitality. That's as differential bodies, to go a bit Deleuzian, we are constantly at odds with any attempt to fix ourselves as some particular identity or to find our place, therefore, within the symbolic order. And so we have to become, or it might help to become, because it's too moralizing to say we have to, more at ease with this life that we embody, this creative evolution that is our place in an evolutionary lineage, of course, but is our actual development, our never ending. So we've got getting away from all of these crystals at the end of time and stuff, getting away from and self-parenting, which I think is a beautiful way you described theology there. And I think again that's the way in which the psychoanalytic discourse is always already a theological discourse. It very much maps.
And there's so many ways in which that self-parenting, that attempt to self-parent can go wrong, just like a marriage can go wrong and you end up with a single mother raising you or a single father raising you, or how our psyche can be. And this isn't necessarily that we inherit how our actual family structure was. I mean, we could deal with that differently, and people who come from a divorced family may be able to, in their theologizing, come to some proper reconciliation of masculine and feminine and mother and father archetypes and whatnot. But there is something like a psychology wherein the self-parenting has adopted the structure of a kind of single mother relationship to the symbolic order and to the meaning of life, and maybe having a certain attitude as a result, negative attitude toward what might be coded as more masculine or patriarchal, the system or the economic order or whatever.
I am, by the way, ironically wearing, I don't know if you have Bluey in
Bluey, yeah.
Bluey. So it was Father's Day in Australia a couple of days ago, and so I'm wearing my dad rocks. This is Bandit. This is Bluey's dad. And so, given we would be obviously
a few episodes, yeah, that's cute.
A little bit. I've seen hundreds of episodes, as one does when one has a small charm. It's great. Bluey's fantastic. I'm slightly ironically wearing this, given that I knew we'd be talking a little bit about patriarchy and the suppression of the feminine, and all of that would potentially be in the background. I think to your point, and I don't necessarily, Lacan's got a triune real of a kind. Obviously, he's got the real as this particular one aspect of that, but so there's a systematic way in which he's distinguishing between the symbolic order and the imaginary and the real, and the way in which those other elements of our lives, of our existence and experience, can block our access to the real, but protect us as well. And I mean, to go Jungian, obviously, defense mechanisms are super, super important, but also there is an optimistic, certainly, reading of the symbolic order and, of course, the imaginary, but in terms of enabling constraints. And, we don't just, we do feel the need, even though we don't want to be repressive father figures who are trying to mold our children into something very determinate, that we have preformationist notion of what a child should become. And also, we don't want to be devouring mothers and, in these archetypal senses, right? We want to give our children the opportunity to flower into the singularities we want them to, that they can be. We want them to individuate. But we, of course, must also give them enabling constraints. We want them to acquire language, that's for sure. So there is a traumatic aspect to being interpolated into a symbolic order, and it's coming into contact with this numinous thing. And there are lots of quite compelling arguments as to that's again where the God function actually is derived from. That's another kind of discussion. There's a Lacanian thing, and also a thinker that I've just recently been introduced to, Brian Rotman, who develops that idea. But it's an old psychoanalytic idea in many ways too, and a much older idea. Obviously, it's even embodied in a certain sense in the golem and all of that, right? The animating word, and then of course we just go back to the John and the logos and all of that, right? So this is not a new thing. But yeah, so it's not a matter of saying that we can do away with the symbolic order. And what I like about these triadic schemes, although they need not be necessarily fully exclusively triadic, we might have a shadowy fourth, whatever, but is the way they admit of, and Peirce is very explicit about this because he's the triune real, it's the three universes. These are aspectualisms, right? So these are different stances, as we talked about the last time we talked about with Peirce, talked about Peirce together. These are stances that one can take towards phenomena and the way this phenomena partakes of the universe of thirdness or the universe of firstness or whatever it is. It's not about saying that, you could, you can do without one function or the other, or being super negative or pessimistic about one or the other. They all have their place, but it's to suggest that one can be captured by, and this is this again the psychoanalytic perspective, one can be captured by the phantasmatic. One can be captured by the imaginary, the defenses, the imaginary defenses that one has to keep from engaging with that unbearable intensity of the real, or one can be captured by the symbolic order. And these are, there are pathologies, and I think there's a critique of pathologization and all of these things, bracketing that as well. But there are ways to become to suffer profoundly as a result of capture by one of these sorts of things. But it's not some kind of, again, atavistic exhortation to immerse in the real, to suspend the symbolic, to give up language altogether, to not identify, or, even as in an argument I had with one of my music professors many years ago, to give up the idea of genre. Genres are useless because all music, is hybrid. It's like, no, genres, we need this kind of thing. It's a map, we need that kind of map. And there's a way, I'll let you respond, but I want to go from this to this discussion that Peirce has of function in here, because he talks about what is man's proper function if not to embody general ideas and all of that. And this I think is a way of getting us back onto the idea of abduction and that. But there's something really interesting to say about function. But when we're thinking about pathology in this sense, so we're thinking about capture by the symbolic order or the imaginary or whatever it might be, we're thinking about, one way of thinking about that is in terms of a perturbation of function. So I don't know if you want to respond to this stuff, but I want to, then I'll we'll talk about Peirce on function if you're keen to go in that direction.
Yeah. Well, there was one other point you had made earlier about Plato's forms and the way that Peirce sometimes identifies them with firstness, but in another sense, they seem to be generals, and so thirdness. And I was thinking of an analogy here, a mapping to how Whitehead talks about the difference between pure potentials, which are eternal objects that have not yet ingressed in the historic universe, and real potentials, or even societies, which for Whitehead, a society is a group of actual occasions that embody some definite characteristic. And so a society for Whitehead is I think, synonymous term for general in Peirce. And societies in Whitehead are emergent, and they're sort of the embodiment of eternal objects that have kind of actual occasions have captured those eternal objects so as to achieve a form of endurance in the world that, I mean, for Whitehead, laws of nature, laws of physics are a result of these social order where these definite characteristics become realized. They're not just pure possibilities anymore. They're part of the historic universe, and their character gets inherited. And so it seems to me that we can talk about the Platonic forms of the eternal objects in these two different ways, and but when we talk about them in Peirce's sense of firstness, they are still pure in Whitehead's sense, and they are not yet determinate. And Whitehead also wants to be able to say that the eternal objects are growing with the world in some sense, or enriched by the growth of the past as the creative advance unfolds, because of the way that these social habits are emerging and inflecting the realm of possibility differently. Or he uses the metaphor of casting a shadow upon the eternal objects in a way that enriches them, because what's eternal, what's objectively immortal, you could also say is constantly growing, right? And so, I think there's a way in which we can understand how Peirce seems to slip back and forth, attributing firstness to the forms while also they're seemingly having some thirdness about them, if we think about it in this Whiteheadian way, with pure potentials and then societies.
I like it. I like it, and I think that we talked about the evolutionary realism in Peirce and the that quote that I read about the Platonic forms themselves growing, and I think that firstness is the yeah, this more indeterminate potential. um the thirds that are more determinate forms are like Kaufman's adjacent possible. They're more like possibilities. There was stuff you said last. I talked about the transcendental illusion of possibility in Bergson and Deleuze, but the adjacent possible are more like actual possibilities because they're close enough to an actual situation that they are in fact quasi-determinate. They're not determined because they haven't been actualized, but they have some kind of form to them. And because of memory and because of our engagement so in a sense, because of the transcendental illusion, we actually can, because we can project backwards onto the possibility that things could be otherwise, we can also then use that same ability to sort of render forms determinate because of their closeness to our actual situation, and then reach for a particular goal state or something like that, even though of course it will never be, and cue discussion of Simondon on concretization, but it will never be as we imagine it until it's actually actualized. And then Simondon on concretization is that iterative process of having an idea for a technical object and building that technical object, and then finding that in a way it doesn't live up to the idea because it's got certain infelicities or perturbations of its proper function. We're going to get there. That cannot one could not have anticipated without having actualized the object, and then iteratively one concretizes it by continually refining it through this experimental series. I can't hear you, Matt.
Yeah, I was muted. If I could just note here, because this came up last time, in the ways that Deleuze inherits Bergson, and actually Royce explicitly criticizes Bergson in his treatment of Peirce, on this issue of whether or not, when we interpret our past, if the possibilities that become relevant to us in the present are our own, are projected from our position in the present, or whether, as I think Peirce and Whitehead, and this is where they differ from Bergson and Deleuze by proxy, is saying that no, the past actually already contains its own alternative possibilities, and our feeling and inheritance of that past includes those alternatives. That's what allows the past to be for us to feel it as what it was. We're also presupposing a feeling of everything it negated, everything that was not realized. And so whether or not the possibilities emerge out of the virtual in the present, or are actually there as sort of propositions that were real in the past, that we feel in the present, but they never became actualized in the past. I think that's a subtle difference, but it has repercussions for how we think about these Platonic forms, these eternal objects.
I think there's a both and there that we'd want to explore. And I think that's actually something technical for us to explore in our writing on this subject. I think it's a really interesting cusp. And I do think, again, Kaufman's adjacency, but these various ways that Deleuze has with the problematic, the solution generating additional problems, which is very Peircean as well. But Simondon has that with this process of concretization. Whitehead has the shadow cast by the actual. There are all these slightly different ways of imaging a reciprocity. And we were talking last time about Farsi and her neglect of that in Whitehead in some areas anyway, some parts of that book. But there are these different ways of imaging that reciprocity that I think are so crucial to our project and the way we're thinking. And I think there's something we can take from all of them.
Yeah, and just one more piece on this, because Fawzi also goes after Peirce and Deleuze for seeing the conceptual as somehow like a folding or a doubling of the sensible upon itself, and that you know, Bergson would want to say that if we had a more complete perceptual experience, we wouldn't need
Mm,
concepts, right?
mm,
Everything would just be apparent to us, and there'd be we wouldn't search for anything else. And what Royce actually says in his treatment of this issue is that Peirce gives us a way of thinking beyond just the dichotomy between perception and conception, and that his idea of interpretation gives us this thirdness and this way of seeing how no account of human experience or anything else in terms of just concepts and percepts is going to get us to something like a truth relation,
yeah.
or get us to anything like what we mean by interpretation, that there always needs to be a triadic relationship. And that, you know, Royce asked the question, when we relate to another human being, uh, who we say has a mind, colloquially, are we perceiving that mind or conceiving that mind? And he would say,
Mm,
well, neither really. We're engaged in acts of interpretation with each other, and mind is itself an interpreting activity. That's what
yeah.
it is. And minds meet each other in that act of interpretation, which is beyond anything purely perceptual or conceptual. Um, and
No, that's
so, yeah,
sorry.
no.
It's really beautiful, and that's a thought of, there is a thought of mediation there,
Mm.
which is thirdness is mediation. And you know, again, obviously Royce is drawing heavily on Peirce to develop that notion of mediation, but that feeds in so nicely to the way we're going to be using all of these thinkers to think through the FEP in more detail, because the FEP is a theory of mediation. But that also then, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, it fits into media theory, but, you know, mediation in our, you know, contemporary situation where we are having all of these mediated experiences through different forms of technology, and increasingly our experience might be mediated for us by certain technological innovations, tools, algorithms that have their own agency, and a lot of their agency is about that mediation, their capacity to mediate our experience. I'm not saying we delve into that right now. I'm just saying that there are all of these really fertile. So another book that we might look at is actually just sitting on my table here, and I noticed you follow him on Twitter, but this is Justin Joke's Revolutionary Mathematics, and you know, that's about algorithms, machine learning, shaping the future. So mediating, becoming, basically, but through the way they mediate our experience. And of course, Whitehead allows us to think experience in a technical sense as the process of becoming, right? So there's a lot here. So I jump into function, or you?
No, I mean, now I'm thinking about AI and the extent to
Oh,
which it might be good at deduction and induction, but
can't do
can it do,
abduction.
yeah, but can it facilitate our own abduction by better preparing us to make the right guess?
100%. Of course it can. Of course it can. How could it not? Because is AI not a phenomenon that we encounter in some corner of one of the three universes, or that bridges the universes in some way? Or, maybe it doesn't have its own firstness, but it bridges the universes of secondness and thirdness in an interesting way. And then do we not contemplate in the play of Musement such encounters, and that will, you know, suggest to us some abductive, the
Yeah.
beginning. And you know, there are a lot of people who say that nobody is thinking, you know, interesting thoughts about AI yet, and maybe that's the case, but it's only through this contemplation of it that we will generate perhaps novel lineages of, unless it doesn't have that to offer for us. But I think, at least on an individual level, it will.
But it's Simondon who says that the role of the human is to be the mediator of these
Yeah, for sure.
machines, right? And so I don't know that the artificial intelligence systems are doing any mediating or interpreting. They're doing deduction and induction all over the place, but are they interpreting? I think that's the role that the human
Yeah.
plays, and it's just a question of to what extent we are being controlled by the designers of these algorithms to
Yeah.
interpret this way instead of that way. And so
There's obviously a cynical view here that they're doing a sham, obviously, interpretation or sham mediation. They do, though, definitely present. We talked about this last time, and they do definitely present new information to us. It's not that's new to us. Now, whether that's part of an ontological generativity or productivity and how that relates to determinism and their status as deterministic systems and all that, that's this deep question that we're also exploring in parallel to this. But certainly they can, it's funny because in using protein language models in my own research, I have been fond of saying, this is just telling me what I already know. Like if I already know enough about three-finger toxins and their structure-function relationships and blah, 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 well, this protein language model can render that very precise for me. And this is to skip the thing about function, but this is the way that deduction relates to abduction. Deduction is the precisifying the explication of the implications of an abductive hypothesis. So that's stage one and stage two of inquiry. And then induction is the experimental testing of those deduced consequences to see whether in fact they match up with experience, manipulated through the experimental process. Well, at least we got that out of the way. We should get to that in more detail, but yeah, I mean, so I have actually that feeling when I've worked with these things that they're not, of course, they're again refining my knowledge of a study system, but this and the sense is that if I knew that system, this is interestingly redolent of what Bergson was saying, even though I feel like it was a naive thing that he was saying there, that if we had more complete knowledge, we wouldn't need concepts, and that could not be sustainable for Deleuze either.
More complete perception, not more complete knowledge. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, perception. Yeah, which I think is nonsense for important reasons. But because again, concepts are going to be related to abstractions and the discovery of generals. So you couldn't have so this analogical allegmatic process, which is what the machine learning algorithms are actually good at doing, given the right grist for their mill. But basically I have the perception, without getting too far off this track, but when working with these things, that I have a very good knowledge of this protein family, say, but I know that I could have a way more complete knowledge of it if I just worked harder and devoted more of my life to studying that protein family. But I'd rather read Peirce, I guess, and these other thinkers, and talk to you. So the fact that what they're giving me back already looks like something that I already knew, it's like, well, I could have even had way more complete knowledge of this, and then they wouldn't have given me much at all. But I want to jump into the thing. So going via Royce, all of that you're saying about Royce, I'm loving, and I need to read more Royce. One of the things that I like about Royce, from what I relatively little I know of him, is this connection between community and religious experience, and thus the commonality of religious experience, and the way that then he has a critique of James and James's varieties of religious experience, where James sort of makes these experiences look like extraordinary experiences that are perhaps the preserve of the few, the sensitive, or those taking drugs, or whatever it might be, whereas Royce is, and this is why I call firstness, the world of firstness, prosaic reality, exactly for this reason, right? That the extraordinary experience is always with us to the extent that we have the capacity to attend to it. So it's common, because we can all have that experience, and it's basically available to us all of the time. And that would be also a way that Buddhists would think about it. But really, the way any contemplative kind of should think about it is that, we could be engaging with this thing in the mode of firstness, and thus this prosaic, and I'll even say mundane, just to be provocative, reality could be revealed to us. And I mean, it's Blake and, heaven in a blade of grass and all of that kind of thing. So I like that. yeah, I'm derailing myself because there was something else that I wanted to say about purity. Well, I'll go to the purity thing because it'll take me back to the commonality and communing, and also this Peircean vision of the universe as suffused with signs, which is very relevant to this idea of community. But I always have this issue, and this with the notion of kind of pure eternal objects or whatever, and it's partly just because they're referred to as objects, I suppose. But so I think only a firstness. So in the sense that forms can be thirds, and so can have this kind of degree of determinacy about them, and they're adjacent possibles and all of that, then they're not pure because they're in this relational dynamic with the actual, and that's what has given them this. So I say only a firstness can be pure, and here I push back against Schmidt. I don't think you can have a pure thirdness. So I don't like the image that we start to get from the Schmidt reading of the neglected argument and various ancillary, subsidiary, supplementary readings, where he's moving. And this goes to places where I think he does the most violence, where it's kind of like, God exercises absolute freedom in determining which of the potentials are actualized. And I'm like, no, that's doing serious violence to the concept of firstness, because the freedom, the chance, the spontaneity belongs to the firsts. It doesn't belong to the third. And it's very contradictory in my opinion. And again, I'm not the Peirce scholar that Schmidt is, so, whatever, but to things that I can cherry pick from Peirce, if God exercised absolute freedom in determining which potentialities are actualized, why would our universe be replete with accidental characters, which Peirce is always talking about? So there's an arbitrariness to actualization, and that is necessary in Peirce's view for the generation of novelty. That's like, I worry that Schmidt starts to turn Peirce into the kind of false agapism, which is an ananchism, a pure secondness masquerading as an agapistic philosophy of love and evolution and blah, 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 which is how Peirce characterizes Hegel. And Schmidt seems to be pushing Peirce in that direction a little bit to me. But that's not necessarily what I wanted to say, except that to make mind pure is a kind of, to me, that's a and that might be a classically Christian mistake, or that kind of metaphysics that I want to avoid in this space. And also there's a whole discussion about Aristotle and the potential distortion of some of Aristotle because of his reception in Western philosophy through the scholastics. And this can hinge on the notion of the hule, the so-called matter, and whether it is the passive prima materia of Aquinas, or whether it actually has its own active capacity, and so it then becomes more like the virtual of a Deleuze or the firstness of a Peirce. And again, it doesn't really matter what Aristotle really intended, but there is a dispute amongst Aristotle scholars specifically on the active capacity of the hule, which is what the hule like of hylomorphism, but hylomorphism then being a kind of bastardized doctrine where you have the active forms and the passive matter, but that's more of a scholastic doctrine than a truly Aristotelian one. And the hule is what is the body, is that it's like the body of the wood or the forest, as this, and I mean that's like the unconscious as well. That's the forest, that's the nature culture divide, the forest that surrounds the city, and that's the active site of generativity. And then that's obviously going to go back into this consideration of fourthness, because and this is an argument against purity that I'm making here, because the fourth, which is the body, is anything but pure. The body is not pure. The body is fallen, feminine even, right?
I mean, the equivalent in Plato here is the chora, or the receptacle, which is sort of like the form of formlessness. And the extent to which it's purely passive is questionable. And like the in Timaeus, there's something vibratory about it even before the nous gets in there and starts shaping, and that there's something positive about the need for a place for forms to manifest, and so there's this similar issue in Plato's conception of what becomes matter, or hule, in Aristotle.
For sure. No, so there's a whole bunch of interesting, sort of scholarly work that to be done there. But again, that's not necessarily the primary target here, because does it really matter what Plato actually thought? Could we ever know? You know, in Aristotle, you know, we're mediated by the notes of his students and all of that. And does it, who cares anyway? You know, they're just generating, you know, they're generative thinkers for us. I mean, I do care, of course, but it's about the history and the lineage of thought that we're drawing upon. But so the body, right, is not pure. And the body has functions. You see, I'm getting to the point eventually, right? The body is functional in the kind of in the biological context now. So there's a few things that I want to really quickly say here on this. And you know, one of the things that, again, about the idea of an argument in this Peircean sense, that the cosmos or you know, any phenomenon that we encounter and we enter into an aesthetic engagement with, so here's the firstness, right, the aesthesis in this Peircean conception, that we get a kind of satisfaction in a study of the form and an appreciation of the form, and that becomes this argument for the reality of God. You know, one of the questions that can arise for anyone who's contemplating, you know, why do I feel really good, and why do I get this satisfaction? Why is there joy in aesthesis and all of that? It's like, and Peirce does bring this up somewhere, whether it's in this essay or somewhere else, but it's like, you know, the question of why is nature suffused with beauty, right? And that's, of course, been one of the big traditional arguments for the reality, or indeed even the existence of the creator God. And, you know, a Peircean way of looking at that without necessarily invoking the creator God would be precisely because nature is suffused with signs. Nature is comprised of signs. And what are signs about? Signs are about communication, community. I'm trying to make this connection with Royce here as well, with community, commonality, with sharing, commune, right? Entering into relations, interweaving, interdependence, the one trying to be seen with the other. You know, a flower is trying to capture the attention of some agential organism. Come here, land on me, collect my sweet, sweet reward, and thus distribute my gametes to another flower. You know, and I'm getting to this is function, right? I don't want to do a kind of gross evolutionary psychology thing here or whatever, but Peirce opens the door to this consideration of function. And this is one of the ways one might think about the beauty in the world. And it's not a, you know, it's not a reductionist sense. The world is beautiful. It is suffused with beautiful, but it's because everything's reaching out to everything else in some sense, right? That's part of the reason. And even the organism, yeah, for some reason a fox is coming into my mind, you know, and foxes in Australia are feral animals and they're associated with the extinction of multiple native species and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people don't like them, but, you know, I was born in England, and, you know, foxes to me are very beautiful creatures, and I see them around here where I live, and you know, I regret that they might be killing tiger snakes and native frogs and native mammals and whatever, but I also look at them, and a healthy fox is a beautiful animal. And then you can't think about in terms of the flower. You know, flowers are beautiful because they're communicating with insects or birds or whatever it might be. But a fox is still communicating with other foxes, you know, and a sleek, healthy, beautiful, bright, russet red fox with, you know, oily you know, like beautiful, beautiful creature is a signal to another fox that, like, I'm good, you know, like, you know, we don't need to get too, we're thinking about bodies here, right? And the way bodies ooze and secrete and relate to each other in all these impure ways. Well, if you're not on a purity jag, you can think about beauty and it's always being bound up in some kind of impure bodily, physical, you know, and of course, you know, I'm a biologist, right? So I like to think about these kind of things. And I think a lot about organisms exchanging spit, or like chemistry of different, you know, different forms, right? But
Yeah.
okay.
And this is right in Plato's Symposium. So you get the whole doctrine of eros, and the you know, beauty becomes the portal to the eternal realms, because it's that one of the big three, you know, truth, beauty, and goodness, that is at least bordering on the sensible. And it lures you into truth and goodness, which are less visible, less tangible, less you know, shimmering in the world of our sensory experience. And so eros becomes the mediator, you know, that brings us here. And beauty is tricky because on the one hand, you get this very puritanical Kantian interpretation of it as kind of an end in itself, and it can't be something that we find attractive even. It's just we contemplate it, you know. If it's attractive to us, then Kant thinks there's something else going on. if
Graphic.
if we want to possess it, Kant would say, well, then
Yeah.
it's not beauty anymore.
Yeah.
But there's a biological function here that shows that beauty is also a means
Yeah.
to creativity.
Yeah, and there's something to what Kant is saying, unsurprisingly, in that if we're meeting the thing in its firstness, then so we can have this explanatory, you know, and kind of quasi-biological model of why the world is full of beauty, but that doesn't stop us from suspending that and engaging in firstness and finding even those things that are, you know, like a naturalist. In their encounter with nature is, I mean, and obviously the romantics, like in the birth of 19th century naturalism and all of that, or even 18th century, but it's very much grounded in this this aesthetic encounter where prior to coming up with our explanatory models and all of that, we're just observing in the way, maybe in the way that we would observe a work of art, but perhaps even less critically in a certain sense, because it's very difficult. Again, I think meeting works of art in you know, in the from the stance of firstness is super important to being able to broaden one's range of, like, broaden one's taste, basically, because if you're always going, well, you know, the form is a bit off, or I like this because of its form, or whatever it is, you know, I like the way they resolve that particular cadence, and oh no, there's too much dissonance there, you know, all of that. If you're really thinking analytically all the time, then you're not in the mode of firstness. But if you can actually come to a work of art like that, you might find that a lot of things that you thought you didn't like are potentially likable, are possible substrates, fourthness, body, for particular kinds of experiences. They can elicit something from you. But naturalism is essentially that, right? Like, I can look at a, you know, so Darwin's argument against the reality of God, one of his arguments is, you know, he couldn't believe in a creator that would create an ichneumon wasp that would paralyze a caterpillar and lay an egg on it, and then the egg would hatch on the living cat, you know. But there is a way. Of course, it's horrifying. That's one mode you can meet that in. It's horrifying. You know, nature is horrific. But you know, you can also engage in that in an aesthetic mode, and that could open to other kind of explanatory modes of thinking about how elegant this solution is and all of that. But in suspending one's, you know, value judgment for a little while, one actually can appreciate things. And it's like Peirce says, you can adopt these different perspectives, but in order to move from one perspective or another, you have to suspend the perspective that you're currently in order to move from one universe to another. So to transition from an evolutionary world where you're thinking about reasons and functions and purposes and all of that, to you know, to a firstness, to a more aesthetic appreciation of the organism, then you have to suspend that mode of reasoning and that might give you actually more insight into thirdness when you move back. You're oscillating. But so Peirce talks about man's proper function. Man, it's all, you know, going to be, you know, patriarchal with the pronouns and all of that. Oh, I so want to get into diagrammatism again before we finish, but I don't know if we're going to have time. But stripping the garb, but because, and the pronouns make me think of that, right? Because using it like a pronoun like he or even they, any pronoun perhaps, for what is, you know, ineffable for God, which should stay in the prosaic and not be dragged into the symbolic order as its guarantor, blah, 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 my usual stick. That's garb that should be stripped away when we're doing diagrammatism. And Schmidt doesn't go far enough on this, but too many things to say. But so Peirce says, what is man's proper function if not to embody general ideas in art creations, in utilities, and above all in theoretical cognition? Okay, this is a big statement. But he also says, if we knew that the impulse to prefer one hypothesis to another were really analogous to the instincts of birds and wasps, it would be foolish not to give it play. So he's saying the fact that some hypothesis presents it to us in intuition, and again, he's arguing that this inevitable hypothesis of God's reality will present itself in intuition when we contemplate on the works as themselves an argument, but not an argumentation. we should give credence to this. But what is the if we go biological again, what is the function of a nervous system, right? So again, it's why do we find beauty in the world, but also why do we find it health promoting to suspend our reasoning, to suspend a firstness and thirdness, rather, to suspend the speculative and the inquiry modes of engagement, and simply enter into the prosaic. And if you believe that mindfulness is a good thing to do, or something like that, then you probably believe this is health promoting. Why should that be? If you, this is a question, this is exactly the kind of question that presents itself in the play of Musement, of mindfulness itself. If one is inclined towards trying to understand what's going on, and you don't have to, you can stay with the firstness and be like, it just works. But what is the deep function then, biologically speaking, of a nervous system, right? It's to embed us in our environment so that we can be responsive to it, so we can detect affordances, both positive and negative, in it, right? So if we're perturbing that function by like ruminating all the time, wearing headphones all the time, like I love music and I love podcasts, but I definitely find that if I'm always walking the dog with my headphones on and I'm not listening to the birds and I'm not listening to, and really engaging with all the firstness around me, that I get more anxious, like especially to the extent that I'm not really even listening to the music as if it's a firstness, because I also have to walk without tripping over things or whatever. So we're perturbing the deep function then of, I'll get back to Peirce's function, but we perturb the deep function of the nervous system by not allowing it to do what it does, which is to embed us in our environment in a way that enables us to detect dangers and things that are good for us, affordances in general, right? And so that generates this agitation or stress of disconnection. And think about, community again, disconnection, not engaging with the other is, we can think about all the mental health consequences of that. We could go on ad nauseum, but we have a vibratory vitality in our nervous system that is predominantly about, or at least in its deep function, about achieving a resonance with our embedding environment. If that's not allowed to happen, we get this internalized agitation, and we're ruminating and we're doing all of those things which we know are not good for us. But so if that's the deep function of the nervous system, how do we get to like Peirce's idea that the proper function of man is not to embody, is to embody general ideas and kind of stuff like that? I mean, you can get there biologically still, and again, it's not a reductionist way of doing it, it's just another way of thinking about it. So we are thinking about the instincts of birds, and Peirce asks us to think this way, the instincts of birds and wasps and all of that. He's analogizing, instincts are lineage properties. They're apt impulses derived from a historicity of being embedded in our environments. And, what are humans? What's our niche? If you think about it in this biological sense, our niche is niche construction. We are hyperplastic niche constructors, and we can move in all different environments, and we can do this analogical thing. We can discover the generals of different environments that enable us to build a home in that environment. That's what we do. That's what humans do. So yeah, I mean, our proper function is to embody general ideas. We're excellent generalizers, and that all comes out of the play of Musement, in the sense of that being a way of embedding ourselves in our environments.
Well, sticking with the biological frame, a lot of these evolutionary Christians like Peirce and Teilhard, Steiner will talk about the human being as not just another species, but like Steiner would say, each individual human being is its own species. Teilhard would say that the human is not just a new phylum, or but a new kingdom of nature. And Peirce, I think, is in this comment you're sharing about our role as engaging in the creation of new generals and doing science, and what makes the human unique. And this is again a Hermetic Kabbalistic thought that goes back to Pico della Mirandola in the Renaissance, who on the Oration on the Dignity of Man, I think the essay was called, where he says the human being is that creature that doesn't have an archetype because we can embody any archetype by virtue of our freedom. And so we can explore symbolically the realm of possible generals and aren't bound instinctually like other animals to our species archetype, as it were. And so there's so many ways that Peirce is resonating with these early modern and even ancient traditions, probably because I know he was reading widely. And so there's so much you said that I want to go back and touch on, and I know we need to wrap up soon because it's dinner time for me. But you were talking about Royce and the importance of community and religious experience in community, and James being overly individualistic ultimately, and making the mystical experience this very unusual, unordinary type of experience. And you really want to get us back in touch with the prosaic nature of firstness, which I appreciate. James says that religion at one point, and Whitehead quotes this. Oh, Philo's hungry too. Whitehead quotes this in his book Religion in the Making. James says religion is what an individual does with his solitude. But Whitehead then goes on to say that religion is also world loyalty, and that's him drawing on Royce when he says that religion is world loyalty. That's the communal dimension.
What about just the etymology of the word and religation? Well, okay, you could be, again, religion then could be embedding ourselves in our environments, right? We can do that in some degree of solitude.
Yeah.
Solitude from other humans, but we are entering into community with our environment, right? Or religation, religio. So that's also the way that that Jung interprets religio, by the way, is the close attention to the numinous, the direct engagement with the autonomous, with the other, with the not I, religio. But it also is the binding of communities, right?
Yeah.
It's obvious. I mean, so
we're trying to relate to some whole larger than ourselves, and when we're in a religious mood. And it seems that for human beings, this isn't just a environmental embeddedness, restoring a sense of ecological relations to other physical organisms, though it definitely is that too. But it's also a sense of being embedded in and attuned to a kind of divine milieu, this realm of ideas, and being able to imaginatively explore generals, as Peirce is saying. So there's two levels of environment here that we can think about in these terms. And then Peirce mentions Darwin and kind of explores whether there could be a explanation for abduction along the lines of something that natural selection is ultimately responsible for. And he kind of invites this by saying, look, the instincts of reason to arrive at the right guess are very much like the instincts of other animals. And yet I think what Peirce is saying in establishing that lineage there is not that our capacity to perform abduction is just the result of natural selection, but rather that natural selection, or selection as such, works because of this continuity between the organism's experience and the order of nature itself. And that the reason evolution can lead to the taking of habits in organisms is because of the continuity. And the reason we are capable of abduction is because of this continuity that precedes any natural event of natural selection, right? It's why natural selection works, right?
Yeah, 100%. So when Peirce critiques natural selection or critiques Darwinism, and he says a lot about Darwin in a lot of different places, and he says that Darwin is much the greater than Spencer, even though Spencer is the more general thinker, and it's partly because what's great about Darwin is his incredible attention to detail. He's a great scientist. But when he critiques Darwinism, he's critiquing it as a theory of secondness, and that's important. He's thinking of it as the way some people have read it, as a mechanistic theory, right? So Peirce is thoroughly Darwinian in the sense that he, like Darwin, is, and Darwin doesn't give us a cosmology, but is a general evolution, and like Spencer, but Spencer is loose, right? And there become certain abhorrent consequences of the Spencerian generalization of Darwinism because he is a loose thinker. Darwin stays in his lane as far as Peirce is concerned, and that's why he's a great thinker. Peirce is a generalist, but has much deeper in his generalization than Spencer. So he thinks he's avoiding those issues. But so yeah, no, what you bring out is 100% so important because ideal realism. Peirce's kind of, I mean, that's the term actually that his father gave him when he was like a kid, basically, or very young. That what we should be looking for here is this ideal realism, seeing idealism as not in contradiction with realism, is it is this doctrine of macrocosm microcosm, exactly as you've articulated it, right? Nature and the mind have such community, are made of the same thing, and that is what gives our guesses this gives our abductive intuitions this tendency towards the truth. And he says somewhere, we catch a glimpse of the living mind by means of our fallible but trustworthy instinct. But we are, when we're in the play of musement, we're at our closest to the real. We're at our closest to the action of living mind. We're embodying the action of living mind, and that's why it comes. So it is a very much in concert with thinkers like Pico della Mirandola, and this hermetic idea also, really, right? That the mind is this microcosm. Yeah. So no, what you said is 100% correct and important. And again, I wasn't, in bringing up the way of thinking about function, trying to reduce, when I'm thinking about function, I'm never thinking about it in this purely mechanistic term, and I don't think it ultimately works. And that's why a real bastardization of Darwin that happened really mostly in the 20th century, but it has its roots in the 19th century, the mechanicization of Darwin is an attempt to say that Darwin doesn't naturalize purpose. Darwin removes purpose. Darwin says there's no finalism. And it's like, that's not what Darwin says at all. That is not what Darwin says at all. And read, I mean, if you can't find it on The Origin of Species, read The Descent of Man. He is naturalizing purpose. He's giving us this tautological posit, as we've discussed previously. I mean, there's a whole discussion of like the posits and postulates in Peirce, and how I think he maybe gets a little bit there's intention with his theology again there, but we don't have time to go into that.
Just that there are so many readings of Darwin, neo-Darwinian readings, let's say, where the suggestion is that you could get growth and learning and instinct and eventually reason in human beings just from secondness, right? Like just from attraction and repulsion and the play of forces, and firstness gets reduced to chance and like the random variation. And I think Peirce is helpfully pointing out how illogical that is, and how even he uses a statistical argument according to Schmidt, where Peirce explores the improbability of evolution sort of just by natural selection and pure chance ending up producing something like reason, or Galileo, leaping to the right hypothesis about motion just purely based on chance, when there are.
I do think that there's again this mischaracterization here, which is common. Like even Peirce talks about absolute chance all the time, and absolute chance to me is like pure eternal objects. It's like, no, Tychism, that's degrees of freedom within context. This is why you've got to think substrates. This is why the fourthness aspect is kind of important. But there's the constraint of the context. The thing happens because it is not prevented from happening by the degrees of freedom in the context in which it's happening. It's not like pure chance coming in as this absolute principle from somewhere else. So like Galileo's, light of nature or natural light, illum natural, which is Peirce's, basically this intuition, that can nonetheless be, and again, given this whole scheme, which I'm not reducing, but can nonetheless be talked about in expansive biological terms. I don't think that should be, we shouldn't see that as being in tension here. I think that
evolution is driven by chance and necessity, as Jacques Monod said, but also by habit taking. and that's an additional, principle, right? That's not already, you can't get it out of chance and necessity. It has to already be in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, some kind of affinity. This is, Peirce will go back to Empedocles at the beginning of Evolutionary Love, sort of love and strife, but strife is the coming apart of things. Love is the affinity that things have for each other. So there's an relationality, a tendency to group into things, and habit taking. Habit taking, Peirce will elsewhere explain, as we discussed previously. It's like the things that take habits that become stable are the things that remain just tautologically. They are so yes, there is this principle of habit taking. There's this principle of like the generation of stable complexes or assemblages, and those ultimately, by the law of selection, it's a very selectionist point of view, are the things that remain, because things that don't things that don't remain things that don't take habits are intrinsically unstable and they fly apart.
But thirdness also has this interpreting activity, this mind that's able to harness the chance and variation of firstness in finding new ways to evade the resistance of secondness. Like this is
organisms do, unquestionably. And you cannot have biological evolution for sure without the organism. So that is the real problem with the reductionist neo-Darwinian account, which excises the organism in an analogous way to the mechanical philosophy excising mind altogether. Those are very much two versions of the same process.
And I think this has to be the last thing I'll throw into the mix for this session, but there's something about this Trinitarian way of thinking about the ultimate nature of reality, where you end up with a vision of the divine that needs to negate itself to create the world, or a vision of the divine that's creating by, like, that God only becomes creator, if at all, after this creative act has been achieved. It's like, until there is a world, there is no God. And until, we need to be able to read these, just as Peirce has first and secondness and thirdness, there's a way in which, he gets tied up in this not trying to make thirdness first. But we need to let go of that desire to have a
absolute first.
An absolute first. Yeah. There's always the three. There's always the relation. And this is why I would rather say God is the relator, not the creator, because you're always in this tension between the three.
That's why I would say that fourthness is first, if you want, because fourthness is all three.
Yeah. Well, that's where we're going next.
Yeah. I found a quote which I'd not read before, where it's not really relevant. I'm just telling you this as a foreshadow for another time, but where Peirce actually mentions Whitehead in 1904. It's in content in.
It's critical, right? I think I've seen this.
It's not critical.
It's not critical. Is he talking about universal algebra, or what text is he talking about?
Yeah, he's talking about one of the things to bring up is that overall Peirce and his invocation of Galileo and intuition and all of that, there's a passionate defense here, and he will be explicit about this a number of times, of common sense. So he is trying to bring a certain sense of common sense back in. So he talks about people. Well, it's hard to jump into this, but a particular trend, a kind of against agnosticism, basically, against a particular kind of agnosticism, pointing towards a new incarnation of the idea of the old philosophy of common sense. In this connection, it may be noticed that the theory of psychophysical parallelism is distinctly losing followers. That's epiphenomenalism, right? So it's hilarious that he's talking in like 1904 about epiphenomenalism losing followers and how much of a resurgence that actually had in the 19th century. But that's that matter is churning away and mind is watching it. Minds cannot reconcile themselves to the notion that consciousness stands an idle spectator of human conduct. Besides, the new logic of quantity, which Cantor, Whitehead, and others have made irrefragable, there's a word that's fallen out of favor, as Peirce has many, shows that even though matter acts directly only upon matter and thought acts directly only upon thought, and though there can be no tertium quid, it by no means follows that thought does not act upon matter, nor that matter does not act upon thought. That sounds contradictory, and I'm not going to read the whole quote, but what he means is that they're two aspects, they're the same thing, right? Like, as we were saying before, they're in such communion with each other that they're the same thing. Jumping from that, I just wanted to bring that up because he mentions Whitehead, but jumping from that to, again, I think a thing that Whitehead has, and that I think also, next thing we do for Peirce, we should read the 5 monist articles. Not it doesn't need to be in the super near future, but because we've gone from the guess at the riddle, which is it's late Peirce, but it's the early formation of the mature cosmology, and then we've kind of jumped to the neglected argument, which is the mature theology in a certain sense. But in the middle is the mature cosmology, and it's fully theological, of course, but in a slightly different way, perhaps. But in Evolutionary Love, he will talk about the ultimate principle basically being like, eros or I mean, obviously he's going to define agapism, but I like this idea that what is fundamental, if we have a fundamental thing, is it's kind of desire and drive. Like it is this and this is an incarnational view again. It's the yearning for some kind of determinate outcome, and that's kind of again, it's like a symbolic, vague way of rendering something primordial. But as Peirce says, and as most thinkers will say on this subject, you can't have something too precisely rendered there. The one thing I did want to talk about, I mean, we kind of touched on abduction, induction, the stages of inquiry, so we don't need to, we should do a talk probably on abduction. We should do a chat on abduction at some
with
point.
John Vervaeke.
Yeah, with John Vervaeke, yeah. If he's still keen, you've got a relationship with him, so you should reach out to him.
I'll reach out to him again. That'll be fun.
But also we could do a chat, which I think is very, and we've talked about it a lot actually, but on diagramming. And Schmidt does bring up diagramming, and he talks about the diagram, the blackboard and the whiteboard and the primordial continuity, and he wants to cash that out as a primordial thirdness. But didactically, fine, but Schmidt will put in brackets 3NS or 1NS behind the different elements of the diagrams, and those are not in the Peirce, right? And so the Peirce, again, this is Peirce struggling with how these things fit together, so it might not be as definitive as that makes it appear. But I talked about this in the when we talked about, I guess, the riddle. But I think in terms of diagramming, there are strong arguments from Peirce himself to avoid God as a word, because I just think and obviously Peirce didn't agree, but Peirce talks about diagramming as stripping the garb away in order to render the relations more definite so that you can actually see the relations. And he does also talk about, if we just speak of God as literally having a mind and all of that, that this would be ludicrously figurative, blah, blah, blah. And I just, my concern, and again, I'm very sympathetic to all of the, like diagrammatically, I'm really sympathetic to everything that's going on here, and I love it. And I really don't think I'm allergic to to this context and even the words. I just think that when you're using God with a capital G and he with a capital H and all of that, that this is the kind of garb that, at least when we're entering speculative philosophy, which is really the culmination of diagrammatism, diagrammatology, that's where we should be very, very hesitant to introduce those sorts of terms, which are so, it's not their own fault, but they're so figurative. They are so imagistic. Yeah.
I mean, at least he's not using the word Christ, because that would be even more particular and offensive to, I mean, God is at least, there are various theistic traditions within the West, beyond the West. And so it's a bit more inclusive, but nonetheless, yeah, stacking the deck in favor of theism when there are non-theistic religious intuitions as well. And so it's
And even
problematic, for sure.
and even the projection in translation of that capitalized G God, like onto the Greeks, like onto Aristotle, even Whitehead, I'm looking at you. That's not unproblematic. Just to, again, we can't get into that, but
yeah. And I mean, in Whitehead's defense, he makes a distinction between three different forms of theism, and Aristotle's metaphysical form of it is distinct from the moralistic form of it, is distinct from the more idolatrous images of God that he lampoons in Process and Reality. But
in analyzing or systematizing what he required in light of the four causes, right? Aristotle found he needed to have recourse to a certain function, the unmoved mover, which then has been, languaged and translated as God with a capital G. But the Greeks were using like theos. I mean, it's part of my name, right? Timothy. In a different way from the monotheistic discourse, which were, the fusion of the Greek thought with that tradition comes later, and a lot of the way we read Aristotle in that Western tradition comes through the scholastics. So that's problematic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's definitely a lot gets lost in translation, and yet we are capable of it. Suggests this interpretive function that allows for the advance of knowledge, and something though is always lost in translation, and that's part of this this chaotic ground that is always with us, that's the sort of brute force of secondness that just doesn't care what I mean, that doesn't let me pronounce a word right, or stands in the way of meaning being conveyed. And so there's all the reason in the world for us to never be able to communicate with each other at all, even when we share the same language. And the fact that we can, I think, is in a prosaic kind of way tremendously significant. And in some ways, Peirce's humble hypothesis is just an attempt to stay in the immediacy of the shock of the fact that we can even understand each other. at
Yeah,
least
man.
half the time.
Yeah, no, that's so beautiful. And I think that the diagrammatic is a window to take on that, like
Mm,
um, the Aristotelian, the structure that Aristotelian is describing and the function that he is describing is the function that God designates in other traditions. So it's a very appropriate translation in that sense. But that doesn't mean we should take it as given or unproblematic or what have you. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Um, hopefully we've done if not justice to this article and Schmidt's commentary, we've at least whet people's appetite to go and read it for themselves. And
Read it. It's an easy read. It's beautiful, and you
yeah,
can
it's
really
really short.
you can commune with one of the great minds of you know recent times, or in his own estimation, one of the great minds of all time, at least
Yeah.
as far as logic is concerned.
Hmm. Hmm. So we'll take a couple weeks off and then we'll do some Jung and
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I've got to catch up on some writing, and my mother-in-law's arriving today
all
as
right.
well, so that'll be nice. Yeah, we'll come back with Jung, but we definitely come back to Peirce, and I think those monist articles are good. And yeah, I mean, reach out to John, see if he wants to talk abduction and its relation to relevance realization. I'm super up for that. And
Yeah.
then yeah, we've got plenty of places to go. I think we continue the theology through Jung. We should get into, I mean, maybe this is just, I've been reading it recently, The Psychotheology of Everyday Life by Eric Santner.
Hmm.
Um, I think you would probably get a lot
Don't
out
know
of
that
this.
one.
That might be something to look at, but I think what I'm getting at is like a
Is he
broadly,
he's a Jungian or
he's a Lacanian.
Lacanian? Oh, okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of Lacanian theology. There's Lorenzo Chiesa. Lorenzo Chiesa and Adrian Johnson have a book coming out called God is Undead. There's a book by Tad DeLay called God is Unconscious. There's quite a lot of Lacanian theology stuff. Lorenzo Chiesa's other book is The Not To, which is about the God lurking in language, God in the symbolic order, basically, amongst
Hmm.
other things. Yeah,
You,
there's a lot
yeah,
of stuff.
that
Yeah.
is an undiscovered universe for me. I mean, I've read a tiny bit of Lacan and Lacan commentary, but
Well,
not
I
too.
think you'd get a lot out of Santner. I think that might be a it's not a huge book, and I think you would enjoy it, and it might be somewhere we could go. It could supplement the Jung in a sense because it's a slightly different perspective,
Mhm.
but there's going to be a lot more commonality than Lacanians and Jungians would usually like to admit. But there's a sense here in which Santner is defending the Judeo-Christian tradition explicitly, and particularly through reflections. Actually, I mean, I say he's Lacanian, he is, but readings of Freud and Rosenzweig, The Star of Redemption,
Mhm.
are
Oh, nice. Okay.
central to this book, and he's defending um, the Judeo-Christian tradition against the sort of more facile critiques that it's responsible for all this violence and that it's patriarchal and we need to get rid of it and all of that, because he thinks fundamentally it's about, and here's where he's drawing on Freud, Rosenzweig, but also Lacan, about our opening to the other and the alien that is always also internal to us, is extimate in Lacanian terms, right? Is both
Mhm.
within and without. And that's the numinous in Jungian terms. And I love how that can be connected to the sort of vital animism that we are drawing out of various process relational thinkers in different ways. These things are so intertwined, but because there's diagrammatically, they're so intertwined, but because there's different language, and of course there are important differences, and I don't want to, this is what I mean, I'm saying there's an important difference between what Aristotle is saying and what, like, the scholar, Aquinas is saying or whatever, right? But also this allegmatic diagrammatic exercise is so important for differentiating our own thinking, I think. And I do think there are tons of resources in psychoanalytic literature for that. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the Jung. So the problem of the fourth, as you may have looked already or know, is part of the psychological analysis of the Trinity. whatever that essay is. It's a bigger essay, and I'm sure you'll read the whole thing. But I think we should, and because there's like history of Trinitarian ideas in different traditions, and then there's an analysis of the Christian Trinity, and then there's the problem of the fourth. I'd really like to focus on the problem of the fourth, but obviously the rest of it is kind of like, assumed background,
Yeah.
which again is more your wheelhouse in many ways than mine. But I'm really enjoying, obviously I love Jung and Whitehead and Peirce, and you can't not engage with the theology with all of these guys, and yeah, it's funny in a way for me, who is always saying no, let's not use the term God, to be talking so much about theology. But I find it incredibly generative, and I think it's a great shame that there's this kind of virulent atheism in the world, where even discussing Peirce's neglected argument on the reality of God would be like anathema to. It's like, oh, it says God in the title, we can't read that. I'm like, that's a
Yeah.
shame.
I mean, it feels to me like that those days are behind us, but I don't know what it's like in Australia there. But here in America, everybody's happy to talk about God for the most part,
Yeah,
to
no,
their
that's
fault.
yeah, for better or worse, for sure. Yeah, no, that's a different situation. I think I'm thinking more about in terms of probably scientific circles in
Oh,
particular.
well, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but I think you're right that new atheism has kind of gone the way of the dodo. It still
yeah. I
has
mean,
yeah.
it's not changing in academia, but academia is in some sense. I don't want to talk shit about academia, but it's lagging behind, I think, the culture at large, which is finding its own answers to these questions, um, which is fine and maybe not ideal. I mean, we want universities to be more at the cutting edge of culture than they are at this point, and there are a lot of reasons that it's not. But in the sort of online, spaces, I think it's become cool again to be trad even. But Christianity also is in the mix again as not automatically old fashioned and silly. And
Yeah,
there's a lot of conversation underway, and it's an interesting time, and it's a crucial moment where there's a cultural shift happening that could go either way. Like, in other words, could be regressive and a reversion, a reactionary return to some kind of traditionalism, or it could go in a really neat direction towards a more um, what's the word for it? Integrative, I'll say integral point of view, where we're recovering what modernity was too quick to reject and strive to eliminate, while also keeping some of the really important features of modern skepticism and
yeah. No,
criticism.
I think it's a great thing, and of course, I note your deep embeddedness within that discourse and metamodern Christianity and all of this, and I, other than my discussions with you, I'm obviously not really involved in that, but I definitely think that there's a space here which is slightly different, yeah, and kind of through the diagrammatology again, we can recognize the structures, the dynamic structures, so the machinisms um, of Judeo-Christian thought, and of even deeper sort of perennialist thought. And Jung's not Jung, Peirce's major biographer Joseph Brent certainly speaks of the late Peirce as fully embracing the Leibnizian version of the perennial philosophy, right? That's a great book, by the way. Peirce, was it Peirce? C.S. Peirce Life. Yeah, it's a really, just at the end, a really fantastic essay called Wasp in the Bottle. And I've certainly drawn a bit on that in our discussions. So, citation there. Yeah, I think resisting the term God is still an important move for me, obviously. But it's not, again, it's not predicated on a distaste for the whole, the dynamic that's there. Anyway, I better let you go and feed your cat and feed yourself.
Yeah, no, Vilo's pissed. He's just sitting over there staring at me. Like, at least he stopped scratching me. All right, Tim. I think someone's blowing up your phone anyway, so you better get to it. Enjoy having family visit, and we'll catch up in a few weeks.
Yeah, looking forward to it, man. Take care.
All right. Bye.